learn a little bit about Ernest Hemingway, and then we'll talk a little bit about the assigned story, Hills Like White Elephants, and after that we'll try to construct a critical essay based on Hills Like White Elephants. And then once you have a basic understanding of the critical approach, you can take it home and you'll be able to do one of the other Hemingway stories assigned for the reading. So let's go ahead and just intro here with Hemingway. Okay, Ernest Hemingway was born right at the turn of the century, 1899, born to an affluent family. His father was a doctor. Mother stayed home, 6 children. As far as everything that I've read biographically, Hemingway had a fairly happy childhood. There isn't anything that I've run across where he's had any sort of major conflict that might have worked its way into his psyche, causing some sort of distorted view of life that we like to read about with all our poets committing suicide and what have you. But as far as I've been able to find out with biographical articles, books, and Hemingway's work, he's had a relatively happy childhood. Most of the summers they spent away from the city, the entire family. Hemingway was a very big advocate of hunting and fishing, spent most of his youth, most of his summers doing so. Relatively good student, not a ace student, but a good student, and fairly good grades, and worked on a school paper, that sort of thing. Let's move on here. Then we see Hemingway at 9, a boy. This is in Oak Park. This is just outside of Chicago, folks, so he's born in the Midwest. We've got Hemingway at 16. He's up at the lake that they would go to, the entire family would go to, and he spent most of those summers up there. And this is probably where a lot of the Nick Adams stories came from. You'll be reading one of the Nick Adams stories. Okay, once Hemingway graduated from high school, he worked for a short time as a reporter for the Kansas City Star. He went ahead and tried to volunteer for military service in World War I, but I believe his eyesight would not, no, he's flat-footed, that's right. They wouldn't accept it anyway, 4F they call that. But he wanted to have the experience of being at a war. And if he couldn't do it via soldiering, he would find a way, and his way was he volunteered for the American Red Cross and worked as an ambulance driver, which, believe it or not, if you will, was a fairly dangerous job, just like a medic in any combat situation. During the time he was in Italy, he was awarded several decorations from the Italian Army for his bravery under fire, working as an American Red Cross worker. He was injured severely. He spent almost 9 months in a hospital in Milan, Italy, recuperating from those wounds, shrapnel wounds, and they affected him physically the rest of his life. He had a little bit of a limp, and obviously some of the pains that come with that kind of trauma to the body. Let's see here. Okay, there's a little picture of Hemingway right outside of the Milan hospital. During the time he was recuperating, he met a young woman, a nurse, Agnes von Kowalski. She ended up being basically the first woman that Hemingway had a male-female relationship with, an affair with. All right, after Hemingway left Italy, after he recuperated, he went home, stayed at his folks' house a while. There was turmoil. The vet comes home, and he had started doing heavy drinking at that time, conflict with his parents. So he left home, got married. Well, excuse me, first he worked for a short time as a reporter for the Toronto Star. Eventually married Hadley Richardson. She became his first wife. Hadley did not come from a wealthy family, but her grandfather left her a little bit of money, and so they were able to move to Paris together and live on this little bit of income while Hemingway started doing his serious fiction writing, getting out of reporting and moving to the field of fiction. While he was in Paris, one of the people that would have a fairly heavy influence on him as a writer was poet and intellectual Gertrude Stein. Stein was known around Paris with the expatriates, the individuals that were intellectually inclined, moving to Paris at the time. She was well known. She had a bookstore, I believe it was called Shakespeare and Company, but it was a fairly popular hangout. She had a salon in there, and a lot of the Americans would come over there to brush elbows with other Americans and talk the talk of the gifted writer types. Well, Hemingway was living in Paris. He got a side gig for a while working as a correspondent again, a reporter for the Toronto Star once more, covering the war in Turkey at the time. This was 1922. After that was completed, after his stint with the Toronto Star was over, back to Paris, meets Scott Fitzgerald, and you probably remember him from Tender as the Night, some The Great Gatsby, some fairly well-known works. They became friends and drinking buddies. Fitzgerald had a drinking problem as well. 1923, Hemingway's first book is published. He's published a few short stories, but he hasn't published a completed volume yet. 1923, the publishers Robert McAlmon published his 3 stories and 10 poems, and also Hemingway experienced the birth of his first child, his son John. Let's see if we can get a shot here. There's Gertrude Stein, probably a little earlier than when Hemingway met her, at least initially. There's the Fitzgeralds. Scott, problem drinker, but successful writer for quite a length of time. His wife Zelda, there's been biographies on Zelda as well. She was believed to have possibly been schizophrenic and was committed to an asylum for a short term. There we got a copy of the first collection. It's a fairly young age to publish. Kind of a pretty dust jacket as well. And there's Hemingway just before he gets famous. Now this is a few years later. In the interim, he publishes another collection of like short fictionalized essays, vignettes in Paris by Three Mountains Press. It's called In Our Time. I believe I've got a copy of that. Let's see. It's coming up. Okay. In 1925, In Our Time comes out, in a reissue. They reissue it, adding 14 short stories, and it's published in New York by Bonnie and Liverite, which is a major international publishing company. In 1926, Hemingway publishes his first novel, The Sun Also Rises. It's not a bestseller, but it does well enough to get him established as a writer. He also has the first of what might have been many affairs in his life with women other than his wife, I guess. He meets Pauline Pfeiffer, an heiress. She's comes from a fairly wealthy family from Arkansas, a big timber company. They are seeing each other, and eventually Hemingway divorces Hadley, his wife, in 1927, and we're going to get a little bit into that when we cover the Hills Like White Elephants, but we'll come back to that. Let's see. In 28, after the divorce, Hemingway moves to Key West, Florida, where he stays for a number of years, and some of his better-known works are put together down there. He also has a second child, his son Patrick, with Pauline, and in 1929, a number of things happen. Hemingway's father, Clarence, the physician, committed suicide from a gunshot wound. And right after that, Hemingway publishes A Farewell to Arms. While he's living in Florida, excuse me, he's actually living in Florida when it comes out, but he moves there during the duration. And A Farewell to Arms becomes very very well known. It is a bestseller. A movie comes out based on it, which also in turn caused more sales. And Hemingway is a bona fide success at this point, financial success. There we have a dust jacket copy of the first edition. Hemingway's father. As far as the relationship Hemingway had with his father, again, it was he had a fairly close relationship with his father. He was somewhat estranged for most of his adult life from his mother, but it hit him pretty hard when his father committed suicide, and it'll show up continually in Hemingway's fiction throughout his life. There we see a copy, Farewell to Arms, also a first edition copy. Okay, in 1927, just with the publication of that collection of short stories, Men Without Women, Hills Like White Elephants appears in there. The first published version of it appeared in a little literary magazine called Transition, an expatriate magazine based in Paris in the 1920s. A lot of the writers of that time that moved to Paris to check out that scene would publish in this. It was a major story in that Hemingway used the technique of leaving out information that the author is aware of, but the readers may not be aware of. What's going on with this, you've heard the term the iceberg theory in fiction. Well, Hemingway's somewhat attributed with utilizing that. The concept of with an iceberg, we have 2/3 of an iceberg is underwater. All you're seeing in the ocean is that 1/3 on top. Well, that's the way Hemingway's stories worked. He believed that a good story, a well-constructed story, has all the information the reader needs within it, but the reader has to find it out. You don't have to spell everything out. You don't have to be literal constantly. And some of that sparse language was developed from his craft as a reporter. Okay. In 1931, he has another son is born, still living in Florida. Hemingway was an aficionado of hunting. He went on safari in Africa numerous times, thanks to his wife Pauline and her rich family. Hemingway spent time in Spain. He was a big fan of bullfights and actually published a book about bullfights called Death in the Afternoon. When Hemingway compiled his stories from Africa, he also put together a novel called Green Hills of Africa. Most of Hemingway's literary career was spent in the public, and the irony of that is many authors that make a living at it are pretty much obscure for the most part, other than the people that read their works. They're not household names. Hemingway was probably one of the first authors to really be a household name on a regular basis. His face was on many magazines. He appeared on the cover of Life magazine, I believe, more times than any other American author up to that point, up until the point he died. In the early 50s, Hemingway did win the Nobel Prize for his book, The Old Man and the Sea. Now, a lot of individual critics did not feel it was one of his best works, but they felt that any author of the stature of Hemingway, with his fame and his prolific output of novels and short stories, deserved some sort of prize. So ultimately he was given a prize for that particular book. On a personal level, I thought it was a pretty good book. Again, reading Hemingway usually requires a little bit of a taste for that sparse language. Hemingway was a firm believer in ignoring a thesaurus. He felt if you needed to use a thesaurus to do your writing, then you probably didn't need to be a writer. There's a copy of the first edition. I have found a copy of that, and when I used to deal in books, and sold it for a pretty penny. It was in better condition than that. Hemingway, many hats in his lifetime, died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to his head. Again, I don't know. I don't know if anyone really knows emulation of the father. I don't know. But he committed suicide in Idaho. Some folks said that his drinking had brought such devastation that he committed suicide ultimately because of, and this is probably the best theory I've run across, because of the endorphins in his body. The body produces those natural endorphins, and Hemingway's endorphins were just shot. He had no pleasure sensory ability toward the end of his life and fell into a deep depression. He ended up having electric shock treatment. And we're going to go ahead and go on camera now. And I'll, oh, okay, excuse me. Mrs. Fenley, this is different for me. It's a new experience. But anyway, Hemingway ended up committing suicide out of depression. He tried electric shock treatment. It did not work. And ultimately, he ended up in the same situation as his father. Okay, we know a little bit about the author now. We're going to talk a little bit about Hills Like White Elephants, and then we're just going to do a cursory look at construction, or the possibility of a construction of a critical essay, not on Hills Like White Elephants, but one of the other Hemingway stories that you'll be assigned. By studying this story a little bit, we should be able to get a good idea of how to develop our essay and how to deliver the goods as far as what you need to do in this class to meet the assignment. Okay, you've read the story. The primary thesis is you probably were able to figure out just from the text, from the story itself. The primary thesis is usually interpreted as that of lack of communication between two people, man and the woman, or on a secondary level, abortion. Well, it's my idea that the thesis of the story in general, were I doing an essay on it today, I would direct that thesis more along the lines of that lack of communication between a man and a woman, with the abortion concept thrown in there as almost like a smoke screen, almost as a literary tool or device to move the story along, to show all this below the surface problem with lack of communication. Now I'm going to give a little bit of information from one critic that I think nailed the idea of the story, Chaz Gorman, in a article in just earlier this year in Hills White Elephant. He felt that a lot of the information that you run across in Hills Like White Elephant occurred, well, not a lot, a number of the little incidents that you see happening within the story, the construct of the dialogue between the man and the woman, happened between Hemingway and his first wife, Hadley, and Hemingway and his second wife, Pauline. One of the ideas that Gorman ran across was when he was working on his PhD dissertation. He ran across a letter addressed to F. Scott Fitzgerald from Hemingway, talking a little bit about, you know, having met Pauline and carrying on the beginnings of this affair. And this was in, I believe, 1925, which was about the time in his life when Hemingway was starting to have problems with Hadley. And Gorham felt that it's these little snippets of life that work their way into the story. There's a portion of this letter to Fitzgerald where Hemingway's talking about Hadley, or Pauline and he are sitting in a train station and looking out at these hills, and Pauline comments about how they look like these white elephants, and Hemingway said to her something about, look at those goddamn white mountains, they look just like elephants. And then Pauline talks about how mysterious they look. And anyway, this makes its way into Hemingway's fiction, and it came up with the idea. There's been a lot of theories on the symbolism of that title, and everything from a white elephant sale, yard sale, to white elephants as far as imaginary figures in fiction. Another aspect of the story that works in Hemingway's real life, the setting takes place in Spain. Hemingway's meeting with Pauline also takes place in Spain. Gorman also points out that, let's see, he points out to Pauline how he has a problem communicating with his wife, Hadley. Well, where have we heard that before? Every dramatic story with an affair in it, right? Well, Gorman's taken this approach, and his primary theory is everything that's occurring in the author's life, not necessarily just Hemingway, but any author, is going to ultimately, if it has any significance, is going to work its way into the fiction. Now let's take it a step further. We're working on an essay, critical interpretation of Hills Like White Elephants. If I've read critical analysis of whatever, this writer, that critic, whatever, I can utilize some of that to get my theories going. If I'm going right from the surface, if I'm not going into anyone else's interpretation of that story, I'm working on my own, then I'm going to have to rely strictly on my own interpretation, face value of the story. And I can go literal, I can take a literal interpretation, figurative or symbolic. It's all going to play in there. We talked about symbolism, we talked about theme, characters. Well, if you've noticed, this particular story works a lot with dialogue to move the story along. It's almost completely dialogue. Very little prose going on in the background. Very little setup for this. It's almost all he says, she says. Well, what can I do with that? Okay, I want to develop a thesis. I've read the story. I have a pretty good understanding that these folks are talking about pregnancy and how to get rid of that pregnancy. If I want to develop my thesis around the idea that, and I'll just throw this out, you'll be doing the same. We weed out the weak, bring on the strong. If I want to develop my thesis around the idea that it is this pregnancy, if allowed to continue, that produces a major problem between the lifestyle that this man and this woman know, then that's the obstacle. That's what has to be overcome. I'm going to work that into my thesis. I'm going to somehow place the main thrust of this story on the idea that if this woman, Jug, will get an abortion, then the couple's lifestyle does not have to change. I'm going to work that into my thesis somehow, that it's lack of the two individuals being able to communicate their ideas to each other that causes the main problem when this obstacle that is placed between them. The conduit for problems in the story is the pregnancy, but it's not the major problem. The major problem that I find, my interpretation, is that of communication or lack of. So once I've established my thesis idea that it is the lack of communication, not the pregnancy, then I'm going to take the parts of the story out that I need in my interpretation, in my critical essay, to explain why I feel it is the lack of communication. Now, when you read your story, whatever one you select, read it for fun the first time, if you will. Read it for enjoyment. Once you've read the story, and hopefully you enjoyed a little bit, then you need to start thinking, what's going on? What's below the surface? What's below the surface of that story that Hemingway was wanting me to know, wanting me to understand? What is the message conveyed from the story, the primary message? Once you can establish that, your theme, then you can work on your thesis, your main thrust. Use a standardized format for your essays, an introduction. Make sure that that thesis is pointed out. If you need to, if you don't feel confident enough in your thesis, underline it. I can live with that. But complete your intro with your thesis. Make sure that you have enough subtopics, supporting paragraphs for your body to support your thesis. And you're doing this while you're, doing your second reading of the story. So those ideas are coming forth. Do some brainstorming if need be, whatever you need to do. Once you've completed your informal outline on that, it's a process of writing it. And of course, when you do come to your conclusion, have a short conclusion paragraph, summarize, don't spend a lot of time with it, but summarize what you've done in your essay. Make sure you reiterate that thesis so that it's clear as day. You're tying up those loose ends so we know, okay, you're right back where you started from with this idea. And remember the whole idea of start strong, end strong. Be creative. Descriptive language will not be held against you. Entertain the reader. Shoot for that. There's no shame in being a good writer. Academic writing doesn't have to be boring. It can be fun. So I want you to go home. I want you to take your time to select those stories. You've got a couple weeks to get this in. Select the one you like best. Of the 3 stories, select the one you like best.